Have you been feeling mentally exhausted lately? Before we begin this message, I want to ask you to do something simple. If you are choosing faith over fear today, write Amen in the comments below. Not because a comment will magically change every circumstance in your life, but because sometimes the smallest act of faith is refusing to surrender when your mind feels tired. And if that describes you right now, know that you are not alone. There are people listening from all over the world carrying burdens nobody else can see. People who wake up every morning already feeling overwhelmed before the day has even started. People who continue showing up for their responsibilities while secretly wondering why they feel so drained all the time. People who smile during conversations, handle their obligations, take care of their families and keep moving forward, yet internally feel like they are carrying a weight that never leaves them. Perhaps you know exactly what that feels like. Perhaps your body is present in the room, but your mind never seems to stop moving. Perhaps every quiet moment becomes another opportunity for your thoughts to race toward tomorrow, toward problems that have not happened yet, toward responsibilities that still need attention, toward situations you cannot fully control. And after a while, something strange begins to happen. Exhaustion starts feeling normal. Pressure starts feeling normal. Stress starts feeling normal. Constant mental activity starts feeling normal. And because it becomes normal, most people stop questioning it. Many people assume that this is simply what adulthood feels like. They assume that carrying constant pressure is a sign of maturity. They assume that peace is something reserved for people with easier lives. They assume that rest will finally arrive once enough problems have been solved, once enough money has been saved, once enough goals have been achieved, once enough responsibilities have disappeared. But what if that moment never comes? What if the reason you feel mentally exhausted has very little to do with the number of problems in your life, and much more to do with the invisible patterns operating beneath the surface every single day? That question is important because many people spend years trying to fix the symptoms of exhaustion without ever identifying its source. They notice the anxiety, they notice the lack of peace, they notice the frustration, they notice the pressure, they notice the emotional fatigue, but they rarely stop long enough to ask where those feelings are actually coming from. They focus on what they feel without understanding what is producing those feelings. And that is exactly why so many people remain trapped in the same cycle for years. Imagine trying to remove water from a leaking boat while ignoring the hole underneath. No matter how hard you work, the result never changes because the source remains untouched. And in many ways, that is exactly what happens with mental exhaustion. People keep searching for temporary relief, while the hidden patterns creating the exhaustion remain completely intact. They keep hoping circumstances will change while ignoring the habits of thought that continue draining their peace every day. One of the most dangerous things about mental exhaustion is that it develops gradually. Almost nobody notices it happening. Nobody wakes up one morning completely overwhelmed. The process usually begins with small worries, small concerns, small pressures. Then those worries become daily habits. Those habits become patterns. Those patterns become mindsets. And eventually those mindsets become a lifestyle. Until one day, a person can barely remember what genuine peace felt like. There are people listening right now who have spent so many years worrying that worry feels natural. There are people who have spent so many years expecting bad news that good news feels suspicious. There are people who have spent so many years preparing for the worst that they struggle to enjoy blessings when they arrive. There are people who have spent so many years carrying responsibilities that they feel guilty whenever they rest. And perhaps that last one describes you more than you would like to admit. The truth is that many believers are carrying emotional burdens they were never designed to carry. They continue praying, they continue reading scripture, they continue doing all the right things externally, yet internally they feel exhausted. And that exhaustion often creates confusion because they begin asking themselves difficult questions. They wonder why they still feel anxious. They wonder why peace feels so difficult to maintain. They wonder why their minds never seem to slow down. They wonder why they feel tired even after resting. And little by little, they begin believing something must be wrong with them. What if nothing is wrong with you? What if you are simply carrying more weight than you were meant to carry? What if your exhaustion is not proof of weakness, but evidence that your mind has been overloaded for too long? What if the real issue is not your character, but the invisible burdens you have accepted as normal? Because many people are carrying today's responsibilities, tomorrow's uncertainties, future problems that have not happened yet, expectations they cannot possibly satisfy, fears they cannot control, and pressures they cannot resolve on their own. That is why this message matters so much, because before peace can return, the hidden patterns stealing that peace must be exposed before mental exhaustion can be healed. Its source must be understood before the mind can finally rest. It must recognize what has been quietly draining it for years. And the first hidden pattern is something most people mistake for responsibility. Most people mistake for wisdom. Most people mistake for maturity. Yet it has become one of the greatest causes of mental exhaustion in modern life. It is the belief that you must personally control everything. And once that belief takes root, it begins demanding more and more from your mind until peace slowly disappears without you even realizing it. And that is exactly where we need to begin. The belief that you must personally control everything sounds responsible at first. In fact, many people spend years believing this mindset is one of their greatest strengths. They call it preparation. They call it maturity. They call it wisdom. They tell themselves that if they think far enough ahead, they can prevent problems. If they analyze enough possibilities, they can avoid pain. If they prepare for every scenario, they can protect themselves from disappointment. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable because nobody wants unnecessary suffering. Nobody wants unexpected hardship. Nobody wants to be caught off guard by life. The problem is that control has a way of slowly expanding until it consumes far more space in a person's mind than it was ever supposed to occupy. Because once someone becomes convinced that they must control everything, they begin carrying responsibilities that were never theirs to carry. They begin trying to manage outcomes. They begin trying to predict every possibility. They begin trying to prepare for every future problem. They begin trying to protect themselves from every potential disappointment. And eventually, their minds become crowded with burdens that have not even happened yet. Perhaps you have experienced this yourself. Perhaps you have spent hours thinking about conversations that never happened. Perhaps you have replayed situations over and over in your head, trying to predict every possible outcome. Perhaps you have lost sleep because your mind refused to stop searching for solutions to problems that were still weeks or months away. Perhaps you have found yourself worrying about things that may never happen at all. And yet, those imagined possibilities still manage to steal real peace from your present moment. That is one of the strangest things about the need for control. It often creates suffering before circumstances ever do, because the mind starts living in future problems long before those problems arrive. And in many cases, they never arrive. Yet the stress was real, the anxiety was real, the exhaustion was real, the sleepless nights were real, all because the mind became trapped in a future that existed only in imagination. Many people do not realize how much energy this habit consumes. They assume their exhaustion comes from their responsibilities, when in reality, a significant portion of their exhaustion comes from carrying responsibilities that do not belong to them. They are carrying today's tasks and tomorrow's uncertainties at the same time. They are carrying real problems and imaginary problems simultaneously. They are carrying their own concerns and concerns that belong to other people. And eventually, the weight becomes overwhelming. One of the greatest deceptions of control is that it feels productive. That is why so many intelligent and responsible people fall into this trap. Because control often disguises itself as action. It feels like you are doing something useful. It feels like you are solving problems. It feels like you are preparing wisely. But many times, you are simply repeating the same worries in different forms. You are mentally running in circles while convincing yourself that you are moving forward. Think about how often people spend energy trying to control things they cannot actually control. They try to control how others perceive them. They try to control future outcomes. They try to control economic conditions. They try to control opportunities. They try to control circumstances. They try to control timing. And when reality inevitably reminds them that those things cannot be fully controlled, frustration begins to grow. That frustration eventually turns into exhaustion, because the human mind was never designed to carry unlimited responsibility. There is a limit to what any person can hold. There is a limit to how much uncertainty any person can process. There is a limit to how much pressure any person can sustain before it begins affecting their peace, their emotions, their relationships, and even their physical health. This is why some people feel tired even after resting, because physical rest cannot fully restore a mind that refuses to stop carrying burdens. The body may be sitting still, the body may even be sleeping, but the mind remains active, searching, calculating, predicting, worrying, preparing. And over time, that constant activity creates a deep form of fatigue that sleep alone cannot solve. Many believers experience this without realizing what is happening. They pray for peace while continuing to carry everything themselves. They ask God for relief while refusing to release the burdens that are exhausting them. They desire rest while mentally rehearsing every possible disaster. And because the pattern remains unchanged, the exhaustion remains unchanged as well. Perhaps that is why so many people secretly feel disappointed, because they expected life to become easier once they became more responsible. Yet the opposite seems to have happened. The more responsibilities they accepted, the more pressure they felt, the more they tried to control, the more exhausted they became, until eventually they reached a point where they were functioning externally while struggling internally. The truth is that responsibility and control are not the same thing. Responsibility focuses on what you can do. Control obsesses over what you cannot do. Responsibility takes action where action is possible. Control keeps searching for ways to influence things beyond your reach. Responsibility creates progress, control creates pressure, and many people spend years confusing one for the other. Wisdom understands something control often forgets. There are things you can influence, and there are things you cannot. There are responsibilities that belong to you, and responsibilities that do not. There are actions you can take, and outcomes you must eventually release. Because no human being was designed to carry the entire future on their shoulders. That realization can feel uncomfortable at first, because it requires humility. It requires accepting limitations. It requires accepting that some outcomes are beyond your control. It requires accepting that certainty is not always available. Yet that same realization often becomes the beginning of peace, because the moment a person stops trying to carry everything, they finally create space to breathe again. The need for control drains peace, because it constantly demands more attention, more energy, more focus, more emotional investment, yet it never provides the certainty it promises. It keeps telling people that if they just think a little harder, worry a little longer, prepare a little more, they will finally feel secure. But security never arrives because control was never capable of providing it in the first place. This leads directly into the next hidden pattern that quietly destroys mental peace. A pattern that affects millions of people every day, often without them realizing it. Because once the mind becomes obsessed with control, it naturally begins carrying tomorrow's problems before tomorrow ever arrives. And that habit alone has stolen more peace than most people can imagine. Carrying tomorrow's problems before tomorrow arrives has become so common that most people no longer recognize it as a habit. They simply call it being realistic, they call it being responsible, they call it preparing for the future. Yet many times, what they are actually doing is borrowing stress from days that have not even happened yet. They are emotionally living in futures that do not exist, mentally fighting battles that have not arrived, and exhausting themselves with possibilities that may never become reality. Perhaps you have experienced this yourself. Perhaps you have noticed that a single concern can quickly turn into 10 different worries. One thought leads to another, then another, then another, until what began as a simple issue becomes a complex mental scenario filled with imagined outcomes, imagined conversations, imagined failures, imagined disappointments. And before long, your mind is carrying the emotional weight of situations that are still completely hypothetical. The strange thing is that the body often reacts as if those situations are already real. Your heart responds, your emotions respond, your stress levels respond, your energy responds, even though nothing has actually happened. And that is one of the reasons mental exhaustion can feel so overwhelming. Because the mind does not always distinguish between a real problem and a vividly imagined one. Many people spend hours every week worrying about things that never happen. They lose sleep over scenarios that never become reality. They sacrifice peace over possibilities that never materialize, yet the emotional cost remains the same. Because while the event never arrived, the stress certainly did. This habit slowly trains the mind to expect problems everywhere. It teaches people to constantly search for threats, constantly anticipate disappointment, constantly prepare for negative outcomes, and eventually life begins to feel heavier than it truly is, because the mind is carrying both reality and imagination simultaneously. That is why some people feel exhausted before the day even starts, because they are not only dealing with today's responsibilities, they are also carrying tomorrow's uncertainties, next month's concerns, next year's possibilities, and the countless fears attached to each one. The result is a mental load far heavier than any person was designed to bear. Many believers unknowingly fall into this pattern because they genuinely care about their future. They care about providing for their families. They care about making wise decisions. They care about avoiding mistakes. Yet caring can quietly transform into worrying when trust begins to disappear, and worrying always demands a price. The price is peace, the price is clarity, the price is emotional energy, the price is the ability to enjoy the present moment. Think about how many beautiful moments people miss because their minds are somewhere else. Sitting with family while worrying about finances, enjoying a blessing while anticipating a future problem, receiving good news while wondering what bad news might come next, experiencing today's provision while fearing tomorrow's uncertainty. And little by little, life becomes less about experiencing what is happening and more about managing what might happen. That is an exhausting way to live. Not because planning is wrong. Planning is wise, planning creates direction. Planning helps people prepare responsibly. But there is a difference between planning and mentally living in the future. Planning finishes its work and returns to the present. Worry never returns. It stays trapped in tomorrow, searching endlessly for certainty. The problem is that certainty is rarely available. No amount of worrying can guarantee outcomes. No amount of stress can eliminate uncertainty. No amount of overthinking can control the future. Yet people continue trying because the mind believes that if it can just think hard enough, it will finally feel safe. That feeling never arrives. Instead, the mind simply becomes more tired. This creates another hidden problem, because exhausted minds often begin making poor decisions, not because people suddenly become unintelligent, but because fatigue affects judgment. Emotionally exhausted people tend to seek relief more than wisdom. They become vulnerable to impulsive choices, shortcuts, distractions, and temporary comforts that promise immediate relief while creating long-term problems. That is why mental exhaustion is not just an emotional issue. It often becomes a decision-making issue as well. A tired mind looks for escape. A peaceful mind looks for wisdom. A tired mind seeks immediate comfort. A peaceful mind thinks long-term. A tired mind reacts. A peaceful mind responds. Over time, those differences become enormous because life is shaped by decisions, and decisions are influenced by the condition of the mind making them. This is why protecting peace is so important. Peace is not merely a pleasant feeling. Peace creates clarity. Peace creates patience. Peace creates better judgment. Peace creates emotional stability. And emotional stability often leads to better outcomes in every area of life. Perhaps this is why so many people feel stuck, not because they lack ability, not because they lack potential, but because they have spent so long carrying tomorrow that they no longer have energy left for today. The future has stolen the present. The imagined has stolen the real. The possible has stolen the actual, and the soul becomes exhausted trying to live in two places at once. There is another hidden pattern connected to this, one that quietly amplifies mental exhaustion even further, a pattern that affects nearly everyone living in the modern world. Because once people become trapped in worry and future thinking, they often begin measuring their lives against everyone else's. And comparison has a unique ability to destroy peace faster than almost anything else. Comparison is one of the most destructive habits affecting mental peace today. Not because people wake up in the morning wanting to feel unhappy, but because comparison quietly changes the way they see their lives, their progress, their opportunities, and even their blessings. It takes attention away from what is present and redirects it toward what appears to be missing. And once that pattern begins, peace slowly starts disappearing. Perhaps you have experienced this yourself. Perhaps there was a season when you felt grateful for what God had already placed in your hands. You were making progress, moving forward, growing little by little. Then you saw someone else's success, someone else's promotion, someone else's business, someone else's house, someone else's lifestyle, and suddenly what once felt like progress started feeling insufficient. Not because your circumstances changed, but because your perspective changed. That is the hidden power of comparison. It convinces people that they are behind. It convinces people that everyone else is moving faster. It convinces people that everyone else has figured life out. Meanwhile, they are struggling to keep up. And the dangerous part is that comparison almost never tells the full story. It only shows the visible results. It rarely shows the sacrifices, the failures, the disappointments, the mistakes, the sleepless nights, and the difficult seasons that came before those results appeared. Many people spend years comparing their everyday reality to someone else's highlight reel. They compare their private struggles to another person's public victories. They compare their chapter 3 to someone else's chapter 20. And then they wonder why they feel discouraged, frustrated, and mentally exhausted. But no one wins that game, because there will always be someone with more money, someone with a bigger platform, someone with more influence, someone who appears more successful, someone who seems further ahead. And if peace depends on being ahead of everyone else, peace will never arrive. This is where comparison becomes especially dangerous, because comparison creates impatience, and impatience creates pressure. Suddenly people stop appreciating steady progress because they become obsessed with immediate results. They stop focusing on their own path because they become distracted by someone else's journey. They stop trusting the process because they become frustrated by the speed of their growth. And little by little, that frustration starts influencing their decisions. Many poor decisions are not made because people lack intelligence. They are made because people become impatient. They feel pressure to catch up, pressure to prove something, pressure to move faster than wisdom would recommend. And that pressure pushes them toward shortcuts. Shortcuts in finances, shortcuts in business, shortcuts in relationships, shortcuts in life. Because impatience always promises a faster route. Yet faster is not always better, and quick results rarely create lasting peace. The truth is that some of the strongest things in life require time. Strong character requires time. Wisdom requires time. Trust requires time. Healthy relationships require time. Emotional maturity requires time. Financial stability requires time. Yet comparison constantly whispers that everything should be happening faster. And when reality refuses to cooperate with those expectations, discouragement begins to grow. That discouragement quietly drains mental energy because the mind becomes trapped in a cycle of frustration. It keeps asking why things are taking so long, why progress feels slow, why someone else appears further ahead, why life seems easier for other people. And eventually, those questions become heavy, not because they produce answers, but because they keep feeding dissatisfaction. Perhaps that is why so many people feel emotionally exhausted despite making progress. They cannot enjoy the growth because they are too focused on the distance that still remains. They cannot celebrate today's blessings because they are focused on tomorrow's goals. They cannot appreciate how far they have come because they are obsessed with how far someone else appears to be. And in doing so, they unintentionally rob themselves of the encouragement they need to keep moving forward. Wisdom understands something comparison often forgets. Every life moves at a different pace. Every journey unfolds differently. Every season has its own lessons. And God's timing rarely looks the same for two people. Yet comparison constantly tries to convince people that they should be somewhere else, doing something else, achieving something else, becoming someone else. And that mindset creates an endless battle against reality. The more people compare, the less peace they experience. The more they chase someone else's timeline, the more pressure they create for themselves, the more they focus on what they lack. The less grateful they become for what they already have. And eventually comparison transforms from a simple habit into a constant source of mental exhaustion. That is why protecting peace requires learning to focus on your own journey, your own growth, your own lessons, your own responsibilities. Because the moment people stop measuring their lives against everyone else, something remarkable begins to happen. They start breathing again. They start noticing progress again. They start appreciating blessings again. And they start experiencing a level of peace that comparison had been stealing for years. The problem is that comparison is rarely the final source of exhaustion. Because once people begin comparing, worrying, controlling, and chasing impossible expectations, another hidden pattern usually appears. A pattern that quietly convinces them that rest is something they must earn. And that belief alone has left countless people emotionally and mentally drained for far longer than they realize. One of the most exhausting beliefs a person can carry is the idea that rest must be earned. Many people live as though peace is something they will finally receive after solving enough problems, after earning enough money, after reaching enough goals, after fixing every situation that concerns them. And because that moment never fully arrives, peace keeps getting postponed. Joy keeps getting postponed. Rest keeps getting postponed. And life slowly becomes an endless cycle of striving toward a finish line that always seems to move further away. Perhaps you have noticed this pattern in your own life. Perhaps there was a season when you told yourself that everything would finally feel different once a certain problem was solved. Then that problem disappeared and another one immediately took its place. Perhaps you believed peace would arrive after paying off a debt, after reaching a financial goal, after improving a relationship, after overcoming a particular challenge, only to discover that every solved problem seemed to be replaced by a new concern waiting for your attention. And over time, that cycle quietly convinced you that peace belongs somewhere in the future rather than in the present. The truth is that there is nothing wrong with ambition. There is nothing wrong with wanting to improve your life. There is nothing wrong with pursuing growth. Wisdom encourages growth. Discipline encourages growth. Responsibility encourages growth. The problem begins when people unknowingly make their peace dependent upon circumstances. Because circumstances are always changing, there will always be another challenge to face, another responsibility to manage, another decision to make, another uncertainty to navigate. And if peace depends on the complete absence of problems, peace will remain permanently out of reach. This is one of the hidden reasons so many people feel mentally exhausted even when their situations improve, because they have spent years training themselves to live in a constant state of striving, always chasing the next solution, the next breakthrough, the next achievement, believing that peace exists somewhere beyond the next milestone. Yet every milestone simply becomes the starting point of another pursuit, and eventually the soul becomes tired, not because life is impossible, but because it was never designed to carry that level of pressure indefinitely. Looking back at everything we have discussed tonight, a clear pattern begins to emerge. The need for control creates pressure. Living in tomorrow creates anxiety. Comparison creates dissatisfaction. Unrealistic expectations create frustration. And together, these habits quietly drain emotional energy until exhaustion starts feeling normal. Yet the encouraging truth is that none of these patterns are permanent. Habits can change, perspectives can change, mindsets can change, and people can change. Because the moment a pattern becomes visible, it also becomes possible to challenge it. Perhaps that is why this message found you today. Not because God wanted to remind you of your weaknesses, not because He wanted to condemn you for your struggles, but because awareness often becomes the first step toward healing. You cannot change what you refuse to see. You cannot overcome what you refuse to acknowledge. And many people spend years fighting symptoms without ever identifying the source that continues producing them. Maybe for the first time in a long time, you can finally recognize what has been draining your mind. Perhaps it was never only the workload. Perhaps it was never only the finances. Perhaps it was never only the responsibilities themselves. Perhaps the deeper issue was the invisible pressure you have been carrying internally every single day. The pressure to control outcomes, the pressure to predict the future, the pressure to keep up with everyone else, the pressure to solve everything immediately. And once that pressure is exposed, something remarkable begins to happen. The possibility of peace becomes visible again. Mental peace rarely returns through one dramatic moment. It usually returns through a series of small decisions made consistently over time. The decision to stop carrying tomorrow before tomorrow arrives. The decision to stop measuring your journey against everyone else's journey. The decision to release outcomes that were never yours to control. The decision to trust even when certainty is unavailable. The decision to focus on today's responsibilities without surrendering to tomorrow's fears. And while those decisions may appear small, they often create profound changes over time, because a peaceful mind tends to make wiser decisions than an exhausted one. If you have stayed with me until this moment, I want you to remember something important. Your exhaustion is not your identity. Your anxiety is not your identity. Your current season is not your identity. Difficult seasons come and go. Pressure comes and goes. Uncertainty comes and goes. But the patterns that have drained your peace for years do not have to define the rest of your future. Because growth is possible, healing is possible, clarity is possible, and peace is possible, even if it feels distant right now. Before this message ends, I would love for you to do something simple. If you are choosing faith over fear today, write Amen in the comments below. Not because that word has magical power, but because it is a simple declaration that you are no longer willing to let worry control your future. You are no longer willing to let exhaustion define your life. And you are choosing to trust God more than the fears that have been competing for your attention. Remember this tonight: you do not have to carry everything. You do not have to solve everything. You do not have to control everything. Sometimes the wisest thing a person can do is release the burdens that were never theirs to carry. And sometimes the first step toward peace is finally realizing that God never asked you to hold the entire future together on your own in the first place.